how does the world end? Well, according to this guy, with a bang.
Metal Gear Solid is a series obsessed with the end of the world, obsessed with the inevitability of nuclear war. Each game has players taking on the role of a guy named Snake, not always the same guy, but one of 3 different guys actually, who all happen to look the same and all happen to be named Snake for various different reasons that we do not have time to go into right now. But in each game, players playing as Snake are tasked with de-escalating a nuclear threat of some kind and neutralizing the latest disgruntled former military group of the day who've hijacked a weapons platform to make said nuclear threat with.
And those weapons platforms are where the series gets its title. Metal Gears are huge robotic mega machines equipped with a battalion's worth of weaponry. In particular, each dons its own type of portable nuclear missile launcher. Their advantage over traditional silos, Kojima posits, is their ability to walk, to station themselves anywhere in the world and launch intercontinental strikes not from a fixed position, making counterattacks nearly impossible. They're a deterrent-proof deterrent.
See, it isn't just regular old nuclear annihilation that keeps 3 different guys named Snake up at night. Metal Gear Solid is also a series obsessed with technology, its advancement, and its role as a catalyst to nuclear war. As Metal Gear's chronology progresses, Kojima gets to show us how these platforms evolve and adapt to their times.
In the beginning, Metal Gears can't walk. The first version, built during the space race, relies on rocket boosters and a runway to pick up enough speed before firing its payload across the globe. As opposed to a pilot, the next, built during the computerization boom, is operated by an onboard expert system, an early form of AI designed to guarantee nuclear counterstrikes like a sort of dead man switch. Later versions would each bring their own advancements, from robotic structures that let them walk upright, to magnetic railguns that fire their nukes faster and stealthier than traditional ballistics.
But what's fascinating is that accompanying each title's main threat, the nuclear walking elephant in the room, are small side threats, bits of experimental technology framed by Kojima as less than the big bad, but whom a minute's more thought reveals the terrifying implications of. Hold up there, bud. You telling me these Hamburglar wannabes have a highly contagious assassination virus that can target specific people by their DNA or by the freaking language they speak, potentially wiping out entire populations and cultures from the face of the earth? And that's not a bigger deal than a freaking robot named after a dog.
Throughout the series, one of these coexistent technologies gets special treatment, though. Just as we bear witness to the evolution of walking tanks, so do we follow the growth of this other, less limelight tech, from inception to its future and beyond. But unlike Metal Gears, we're not meant to think too hard about it. Its authorship is never revealed, we don't know who designed it, who made it, or even really how it works. It operates quietly in the background, and we're only capable of perceiving its outcomes, framed often as practically supernatural. Kojima's comfortable using it as a magic substitute, a band-aid to patch up impossibilities, fill plot holes, and support video game cliches. Very rarely is this technology directly weaponized by either sides of the game's conflicts. It's relegated to a supporting role in a story mostly about nukes, with one exception. Metal Gear Survive is the first and only game in the series to focus on the dangers of nanomachines.
Is it from the nanomachines?
Nanomachine.
Nanomachine. The president is wired with nanomachines.
Nanomachine. Nanomachines.
Nanomachines.
The kid's wired with nanomachines. Nanomachines.
Tiny little medical robots that run through people's blood, monitoring their health, regulating their bodies, controlling their expression, and to some, granting them superhuman abilities. Survive dares to finally depict a not-so-immediate nor explosive threat to the world, but a more realistic one that creeps up ever so slowly.
And I think if the game had said that straight out the gate, rather than keep it a twist for the end, fewer people would have jumped to conclusions about its quality, and way more would have been interested to see what else Survive has to say about the series it ultimately concludes. Because that's right. Not only is Metal Gear Survive not complete garbage trashola, nor inconsistent with the rest of the series, gameplay-wise, it's actually the most like previous titles, and narratively, it follows through on concepts stacked by previous games to spell out an ending to Metal Gear Solid's world that feels, dare I fucking say it, less inevitable than nuclear war.
So here's what you need to know about your least favorite zombie game you've never played. 2018's Metal Gear Survive is an open-world survival game that reuses the world and core systems of 2015's Metal Gear Solid 5 to serve an entirely different style of gameplay. It's the first and only new game since the controversial firing of series creator and all-round super pervert Hideo Kojima, which is why everyone decided to abstain from it, but also why none of the characters here are fully naked. The map itself is moderately changed, reflecting an apocalypse whose aftermath the story takes place in, specifically as you uncover in a twist towards the end, 200 years after, making this the furthest into the future the series has ever taken us. Key landmarks and infrastructure from the original game are found scattered in varying states of decay, and much of the once familiar map is now covered in a thick dust that serves as the game's primary threat. As is expected for a survival game, construction and crafting play key parts in it too.
An apt comparison, if we had to make one, would be to how the Zelda series often follows up its major titles with sequels that reuse existing assets but with a twist. In particular, the way Survive places dungeons and threats where there didn't used to be reminds me a lot of how Tears of the Kingdom treated Hyrule's overworld. Another apt comparison is of course to Death Stranding. To make a long story short... Do you hear that? Anyway, both games share a lot in common. I'm not the first to notice this, but hey, we're almost halfway through the decade, so it might be the last. There's been speculation as to whether or not Kojima's pompous dismissal of any involvement at all was true, especially given some suspicious past comments about the things he'd want to do with zombies if ever he got the chance, and of course the eventual similarities between Survive and his first solo project. But sadly, the inter-org politics are such that nobody on either side is willing to talk about it, so let's leave it at that. My read is that video games take a lot of time to make and are collaborative efforts. As much as Kojima's reached this auteur status, he's not writing either the scripts or the code for these things alone. The ideas floating around for themes and systems that eventually found themselves in Death Stranding were most likely shared before the breakup. Then following the split, each team kind of built their own interpretation with what resources they had. Kojima took his designer with him, which is why all of the characters and costumes look sharp as hell in Death Stranding, whereas best I can pull off to Survive is Nigel Thornberry. Konami still had Silent Hill talent on their side, giving the world and its creatures a unique, otherworldly terror, while Death Stranding's monsters look like sins I've committed in gas station toilets.
The dust is where most of the game actually takes place. Past the massive wall of thick beige air, your visibility is severely limited. Interference from the storm raging around disables arguably your most important tool in an open-world game, the map. Half-blind and with no way to know exactly where you are or how exactly to turn around, you're free to wander, finding resources to collect, survivors to rescue, and of course, enemies to kill and scavenge from. The dust is where the game's monsters roam. These crystalline zombies come in different styles, fulfilling roles common to horror/survival games. You know, one fires projectiles, another moves slowly and explodes, that sort of stuff. Luckily, their bodies are composed of the game's most important resource, chiral crystals, ambiguous magic crystals that you can use to patch your oxygen tank. See, the moment you step foot into the dust, a clock starts ticking down, your air supply. As it approaches its empty point, you can choose to refill a portion of its max capacity at the multiplicatively increasing cost of crystals. Like, first time it costs X amount to restore 80% of your air. Later, maybe it's twice as much to restore 40%. So the further you push yourself, the more oxygen and crystals you use, the more you're incentivized to fight enemies to collect more. But it's a balancing act. You don't want to expend too much oxygen killing those enemies in the first place, as, unless you've got the moves, it might take longer to fight them than sneak past. Stealth still has its place here. After all, this is a Metal Gear game. The dust is where all the game's salvageables are, and like diving, you can't stay under for too long. You've got to surface every once in a while for air.
Okay, now I'm going to need to shit all over Metal Gear Solid 5 for a sec. Just take a deep breath, it's gonna be fine. Do your cross, sage your room, do whatever you need to do to get ready, just let me empty my bowels here for a sec, okay? Okay. In terms of cat and mouse, Metal Gear Solid had always been a series about being the mouse. You were at a disadvantage, you were fragile, outnumbered, and running on limited supplies, always on the verge of being caught. You were encouraged to make as little noise as possible, and your mistakes had consequences. Fighting consumed your limited ammo. Killing meant a pile of dead bodies to hide away. Damage taken didn't auto-heal, you'd have to replenish it with rations. Fuck, the game literally made you face each and every one of your victims a second time by making their ghosts come after you. Metal Gear Solid was a game like no other.
Then in 5, they just threw it all away. They made it a game like every other. They adopted a new genre, the open world, without properly verifying that it suited their style, and transformed MGS into just another sandbox game.
Meaning it's not just another nuke.
Their protagonist's iconic voice actor wasn't the only thing about him they'd left in the past. No, this was no longer about a guy named Snake who had to sneak around and scurry on through. You were the Cat, a goddamn super soldier with the reflexes of a bear trap and the speed of an Olympic sprinter. You could run, dive, duck, shoot, and blast away everyone in your path. You could call in supplies and airstrikes, and even in stealth, you could immediately balloon or wormhole away any evidence that you'd ever been there.
Nothing about what Metal Gear Solid was before 5 led logically to where it ended, an open-world game. Metal Gear Solid wasn't about riding a horse through a vast, lifeless desert. It was a game about claustrophobia, hugging the sides of visually complex, futuristic hallways and ducking into air vents. And so, it's an absolute fucking miracle that in the font of Metal Gear Solid 5, Survive manages to bring it home. It recontextualizes each of these new mechanics, returning the series to its survival stealth roots while matching its pace to its new scale. Survive makes the open world make sense.
The fluidity and overpoweredness inherent to the character controls are still there, but they're balanced out by being channelable at the cost of resources. In fact, that was one of the team's main goals. They recognized that the greatest artifacts to come out of their previous game were the action controls, and they wanted to adapt them to a different genre. You can tap into the super soldier moves, but how effectively and for how long depends on your stamina, your hunger, your thirst, your health, which themselves depend on your available food, water, recipes, and medicine. The gunning in running and gunning is limited by your ammo manufacturing capability, which itself depends on your crafting resources like copper and gunpowder, but the more things you carry, the heavier your inventory, and so all these resource-driven abilities and systems need to be balanced against your weight, too.
Not only are the crystallized enemies a threat, but the open world is too. Its scale forces you to plan around it like you would a fight. You have to take stock of your equipment and scout out the challenges ahead to decide on the best way through it, and... Shit, I'm not crazy, right? You guys are hearing that too? Anyway, it's a constant battle against the environment and the surprises it throws your way, which, if you're a longtime fan of the series, should sound very familiar. You know what, I revoke your right to call Metal Gear Survive worthless schlock because it literally follows the same blueprint as, let's be honest, your favorite game in the series.
See, Survive wasn't starting from a blank page here. Metal Gear Solid had delved into survival mechanics before in its landmark prequel. Snake Eater pumped a ludicrous amount of depth into its world and scenes by forcing players to pay attention to such minutiae as Snake's tummy rumblings and stress. Your stamina needed to be carefully monitored to ensure peak performance. The rich, luscious biomes were home to a ton of flora and fauna you could use to your advantage as resources. Like the title suggests, you spent a lot of time hunting and eating snakes, but they were also useful as cues. You and your enemies needed to be careful not to startle nearby birds or else give away your positions to each other. And that was really cool too. The survival system went both ways. Your own stored food would spoil, so enemies' pantries could be raided for their non-perishables or sabotaged to hurt their morale. You needed to keep your stamina in check, but so did the bad guys. Void a special late-game item, it was also the first game not to include rations, a series staple that immediately restored health, fit with an iconic sound effect and all. It was ballsy to exclude that shit. No, in Snake Eater, you were forced to tend to your wounds, eat, and rest to regain health. It truly was a game like no other.
Sadly, these survival mechanics were never revisited. Future titles began allowing their snakes to perform feats of superhuman strength and agility with little to no cost. The closest they came back was in Metal Gear Solid 4, where Snake's stamina meter was replaced by a mental health bar, which you could restore by either smoking cigarettes or calling your in-game therapist and shaking your controller, which in turn caused her boobs to jiggle and presumably Snake's mental health to improve. Because, say it with me, and deny it all you want, but you're wrong, Kojima is a huge fucking perv and you need to stop worshipping him, please.
By the time we got to the fifth game, the signature life bar itself was finally retired in favor of auto-regenerating health and blood splatters, the sort of thing you'd see in an action-oriented shooter like Call of Duty. So, Survive picks up mechanically where Snake Eater left off. The game's director, Yoda Tsutsumazaki, who'd been working on the series as a writer since MGS3, made it his mission to retrieve as much from everyone's favorite jungle game as possible and adapt it to the world of MGS5. Back is the stamina meter, but new are different ways to replenish it. Hunting makes a return too, but resources like animal meat and plants can now be cooked into meals to improve their nutritional value. Each food source also replenishes the new hunger and thirst meters differently, with wetter foods substituting drinks at the cost of more weight, which itself determines how fast you can walk, whether or not you can sprint, and how much of a toll movement takes on your stamina. Injuries are back too. Attacks don't just subtract arbitrary amounts from a health bar, but instead each hurt differently depending on how and where you were hit. Just like MGS3, you need to enter a status menu and administer appropriate treatments to heal your distinct wounds. However, rather than scavenge medicine straight up, it needs to be crafted from resources collected on your excursions.
This probably sounds like a lot and maybe even kind of boring if you're not used to survival games, but the point here is that you get waves of that awesome big boss shit, but you have to drip feed it. It's a reward you grant yourself for balancing all the depleting survival meters well enough. Like, half of the game is actually doing all the cool combat stuff and action and all that shit, and the other half is building the system that feeds you, that lets you do all this stuff.
Now, I've been bringing up crafting and manufacturing a lot, and the idea of heading out to go scavenge. Where you go out from, and where a lot of the resource management happens, is in your base. It's not only a place to deposit and work with the items you've collected from the dust, but Mother Base is also where you can grow them, as in herbs, vegetables, and animals you discover can be farmed here. From the radio center, you can also send your troops on reconnaissance missions to pick up some of the rarer things like copper and gunpowder in parallel to your own missions. This is where you research weapons, armor, treat your staff, no surprise if you played some of the other Metal Gears with base building mechanics. Though rather than handle all this through automation or pages and pages of menus, you're forced to be very hands-on with Survive's Mother Base. In addition to accumulating resources here, your base also needs to be defended from occasional enemy intrusions. It's not just some isolated offshore facility disconnected from the rest of the world, it's on the map. Every excursion begins and ends with you passing through its gates and surveying your home. And so just like you can walk to and from it, so can certain enemies. Your huge water treatment tanks and animal pens and scrapyards and infirmaries are only useful to you if you can defend them. To do so, you're allowed to design its exact layout and organize things as you'd prefer defending them. A consequence of which is that you feel a lot more attached to this base than usual. Its structure begins resembling your playstyle. For instance, via a couple of lucky outcomes, I was able to get enough resources early on to build a pretty powerful baseball bat. Its quickly degrading durability meant it wouldn't last forever though, so I opted to use it only as little as possible. As such, I needed ways to incapacitate enemies up close that didn't always rely on my melee weapon. So, to defend my base, I placed wooden spike traps around its perimeter. Enemies aren't stupid and don't walk into these naturally, so I'd lure them close, then position myself behind them and punch them straight into the trap. The punch itself does barely any damage, but smacking them into the spikes was a critical hit. Using this base layout technique, I could slowly take out entire groups without the need of my bat.
I imagine a player who relied more on ranged weapons like the bows or guns might focus on constructing mountable structures with verticality, but I played up close and personal, which my base ended up reflecting. Despite its smaller scale, the base here feels a lot more fleshed out. There's much more to do, and you have much more say into how it's all done.
The base doesn't work without a constant stream of incoming resources though, so no matter what, you're forced to head back into the dust to collect things to sustain it. There's a lot of transiting between points of interest in the dust. The game's Snake Eater style survival core means avoiding enemies altogether to save stamina is a totally viable option. Like I said, this is a stealth game. Besides combat, the other, arguably more present challenge here is keeping your bearings. One thing that Metal Gear Survive does better than any other game you'll ever play is make you feel lost.
The dust itself and its eerie vibes are only half of it. Survive gets that one of the scariest things about open worlds is their scale. Not only does a map this big consume resources to survey, but its vastness alone is disorienting. The reduced draw distance is part of it, of course. The world is massive, yes, but the dust only lets you see it in small chunks. Thick particles from the perpetual storm ravaging the Earth obscure all beyond a few yards out. You don't get to see the whole place at once. It draws tension from not knowing where exactly anything is or what lies ahead.
But it also plays some pretty nasty mechanical tricks here. The moment you step into the dust, your connection to Mother Base's network is severed, and the tools you took for granted that helped you navigate Metal Gear Solid 5's overworld are taken away. Your waypoints, gone. Your map, pure static. You can't just press a button to pinpoint your exact GPS coordinates, nor your destinations. Instead, you have to learn to rely on something a little more basic. The compass. Survive brings back one of my all-time favorite features from the whole series, the sense ring. What I would do to have one of these in real life. This wonderful fucking hula hoop reacts to the presence of nearby threats, but in addition to its normal capabilities, it now also shows the 4 cardinal points. The way you learn to navigate the dust is by paying close attention to how your compass is pointed as you enter the wall, and use that as a reference to tell whether you're heading deeper into it or back towards your starting point. It's gutsy as fuck for a game this big to turn off your map, hand you a compass and say, your situational awareness is stretched to new limits as you're tasked with remembering in which direction and for approximately how long you've walked, retracing your steps mentally, and guesstimating how far you might have fallen off trail whenever you lose your orientation. This would be borderline unplayable if it weren't for one concession they make for you. When you step foot on a road, you regain a partial connection to your home base. It doesn't give you your whole map back, but it does re-enable your markers. Now, if you're like me, you'll use this to kinda cheat the game into telling you approximately where you are. With clever placement of map markers, you can use these short roadside reposes to trick the game into telling you whether you've walked further or not from a particular landmark. I hope my visual here does it justice, but like, in English, what you do is place a marker somewhere ahead of you, not necessarily where you want to go, just somewhere way in front. Then, if ever you're lucky enough to stumble upon a road, you stop and check in which direction and how far away the map marker still is. You compare that against your assumption of where and how far it should have been, and if you're totally off, this is your chance to recalibrate yourself. Now, if you're a dumbass, you might be saying, well, why not just stay on the road the whole time? Nice try, dumbass. Turns out the roads weave around, but don't all lead to points of interest, and with every step depleting your oxygen and nerfing your stamina,
Pay attention to your stamina.
you've gotta haul ass more directly than the roads sometimes take you. So instead, you learn to read your surroundings and try to use trigonometry to figure out where the fuck you might be. The dust, as we know, is not breathable. The second you enter, your character equips their oxygen mask and the timer starts. The deeper you delve, the higher the chance that you won't have enough time or air crystals left to return, which is tense. Until you learn where the world's little oases are, you have no idea whether there's a safety net up ahead or not.
In MGS5, running literally across the entire map was a brainless activity. It was a free action. Once you'd upgraded Snake's sprinting speed, you were faster on foot than by any other method of transport. Survive looks at that, calls it bullshit, and couples its survival systems to running. Yes, you can haul absolute ass, but only if you're not carrying too much, and only if you have enough stamina, and only if you're not thirsty. It offers you the super soldier fluidity, but it makes it your choice to make all of the necessary sacrifices in advance to unlock it. And if you fuck up, there are consequences.
Like, it gets to the point where stumbling upon a car or a walker is a nerve-wracking experience. Vehicles, by their ability to improve your range without expending stamina, plug into the survival systems. A trip by car gets you further and leaves you less hungry and thirsty. With a car, you can explore deeper, but at the risk of never coming back. If you drive too far and then damage or lose your car in the dust, you might be stuck out there without enough food and water for the long walk back. By intelligently restricting its character controls, not allowing you to sprint across the map, Survive manages to make vehicles matter more than they did in the game it's based on. Fucking brilliant.
Comparing this to Metal Gear Solid 5 is a little unfair because unlike it, Survive is a finished product. But the systems here feel so much more deeply coupled to the open world than they did in its source material. Vehicles didn't matter for shit in 5. You literally outran them on foot and could launch more ordnance from the hip. And comparing it to Death Stranding isn't really fair either because, unlike it, Survive is less about the innate physical challenges of traversal and more about the mental challenges. Your brain is constantly running through a dozen different risk-reward scenarios trying to decide what's worth it and what isn't, all the while... Shit, you heard that too, right? Fuck, I thought we had more time. Just, keep your head low, stay quiet. Fuck.
The Lord of Dust is Metal Gear Survive's home run. This concept alone proves that Survive gets the open world structure, more so than its predecessors and more so than most other games of this type. Open world and horror don't often go hand in hand. The freedom afforded by sandboxes means something's only as scary as you let it be. Massive games filled their worlds with small-scale enemies that can be evaded as easily as the cops in Grand Theft Auto. The option to just go away somewhere else is always at your fingertips.
Metal Gear Survive dares wonder why, since what distinguishes open worlds is their scale, Why not fill them with threats to match? Why not let loose an enemy so large that its entire form can't be contained within a single screen? A massive entity so huge and so disruptive that it can't be run away from any more than you can hide from a mountain. Its presence alone altering your approach to every scenario it interrupts.
Metal Gear Survive's best idea, by far, is the Lord of Dust. A monstrous human centipede-looking creature that roams the storm aimlessly. Its unpredictability means you can't plan around it, and the limited visibility means you can't see it coming. But once it does show up, it's practically all you see. It's larger than any other creature, it's more at the scale of a landmark. Its body stretches beyond the game's draw distance. Louder than fucking hell, impervious to damage, The Lord of Dust is such a brilliant open-world adaptation of the stalker horror game trope. A pursuer who can't be overcome and pops up when you least expect it. Tying into survival in transit, it's so huge that it blocks routes. It doesn't need to just be powerful. This is a survival game where every moment counts. It's threatening enough just as a mild inconvenience. It's like getting stuck at an intersection because a train is crossing. You have no idea how much longer you need to wait because this thing is so incomprehensibly massive that you can't see either end of it. With your oxygen quickly depleting, each second spent waiting makes it harder to breathe, harder to walk. Not only is it physically dangerous, but waiting carefully for it to pass saps away one of your most precious resources: time.
Okay, now, did I start this video off describing how Metal Gear Survive is actually the canonical ending to the series, and how that's one of the interesting things about it, and that I promised I would explain why that is, and then instead of explaining why that is, I spent my entire time forcing you to learn a little bit about a game and consider it seriously for the first time ever? Yeah, that's like my whole shtick at this point. And if you're a little fucker who saw the timestamps and skipped straight ahead, just remember that Santa Claus keeps a tally of your every sin, and on December 24th he will come down your chimney and he will punch you in your fucking head. You know what? Why don't we just fucking get the green screen and make this legit?
Huh? Okay, let's go.
Okay, now that we've got all the pieces in place, let me give you the abridged version. And apologies in advance, there's a lot going on here, I might fall in and out of focus. But the magic portal that takes all of these characters to this alternate dimension turns out not a magic portal, actually a time travel portal, making this alternate dimension not actually an alternate dimension, and instead just the regular world 200 years into the future. Cool. Now, why the fuck is it covered in dust, and why are all of the people here crystallized? Well, here's the twist. This dust isn't sand or dirt, it's an accumulation of, say it with me now, nanomachines. Nanomachines that have gone rogue and are eating up all usable matter in the world to fuel their self-replication. That's what the dust is, a huge storm of mechanical termites chowing down on whatever's left. So those crystal-headed zombies, turns out not zombies, but walking accumulations of nanomachines, medical robots turned against their hosts. Their appearance is heavily inspired by former series antagonist Senator Armstrong, whose nanomachines allowed him to, well, let me let him explain it.
Nanomachines, sir. They harden in response to physical trauma.
So these big-ass monsters like the Lord of Dust and all these other fucking freakazoids, they're huge colonies of nanomachines, continuously growing and adding more to their hive mind after having already conquered most of the world. So why did they need the time travel? Why did the gray goo open a wormhole over a military base and suck up a bunch of shit into the future? Well, because they're running out of resources in the future. Survive spells out that the inevitable end to Metal Gear Solid's world is a how much of the universe is now paperclips type ending. But the problem with those is that they have a limit. The more material the bots use to replicate, the less material there is to continue replicating. Eventually, they're destined to run out. So Metal Gear's nanomachines point their superintelligence towards the problem of time travel and find themselves a loophole. Every time they run out of resources in the future, they open portals to the past, to before their consumption began, and they siphon things they haven't yet taken. Survive says that the way Metal Gear Solid is destined to end is with magic substitute technology finding an infinite matter glitch and endlessly reconsuming the entire contents of the Earth over and over and over again. It's implied that this cycle has repeated already many times before your character is pulled into it. Also, it's a great excuse to reuse assets from the previous game. It's like Majora's Mask, kinda. The whole world is stuck in this endless apocalyptic cycle where all of the stuff in the last game keeps cropping up. Ultimately, your goal in the story is to find a way to sever the loop, to end the cycle. How do you kill it? Well, by going to Africa and scavenging pieces of, actually, You know what? Hopefully I've piqued your interest by this point. I've spoiled enough already, so I'll leave it to you to figure the rest of it out. The story itself is a little cliche, but just like the gameplay and survival systems, it's not pulled out of a hat. Survive isn't, as many people sorrowfully assumed, a spin-off. It follows right in the footsteps of the games that came before it, and tasked with telling an end to Metal Gear, it chooses to highlight a dangerous technology often ignored by the inhabitants of the world of that series, and even its own author. It's not a boom, there goes a nuclear explosion wiping out all of humanity. It's more of a bloop. 99% of the material on Earth is now nanomachines. Kojima made self-replicating nanomachines the core ingredient to a sci-fi catastrophe, a mainstay in his series where he instead constantly banged the drum of inevitable nuclear annihilation. That's like if you made a knife pie and filled it with cyanide and then said, don't worry about the cyanide, that's just for flavor. It took him getting fired for his staff, many of which had been contributing to the series since its inception, to finally say, hey, we all know where this is headed. Let's call a wrap on this thing. Let's end Metal Gear. It was bold enough of a move to release a game in this series after Kojima's exit, but it was even bolder to release a good, dare I say it, an excellent game that ties a bow around this series without straying too far from its roots. Bravo. As for this, why have I been carrying a cake with me this whole time? There's no pun or joke in this one. It's it's literally my birthday. I don't know. Call me Metal Gear Solid 3 Cake Eater, because I actually, you know what? No, not true. This is fucking inedible. There is so much fucking wax atop this goddamn. Oh shit! It's just burnt wicks, like dead. It's just like a fucking battlefield happened here. I just kind of gave up halfway through. Yeah. There's no bit to the. I could have, and I guess, like, I think my expectation was after doing all this fucking shit, I could like take a bite of this, but there, genuinely, I think I would die. So, to avoid that, I'll see you guys next time. Fuck off.
That's a real pickle.